Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Rosie from the University of Birmingham, and this short presentation is an introduction to energy justice as a concept and as a theoretical and analytical framework. So let's start with a definition. What exactly do we mean by this concept of energy justice? Well, energy justice is essentially concerned with fairness within various aspects of energy systems. This involves being concerned with how benefits are shared, but also with how any negative impacts are shared too, and making sure that no one is unreasonably impacted. Energy justice also means looking at processes and governance and making sure that they're inclusive. And you'll probably see from further reading that energy justice is closely connected with environmental justice and climate justice, and it shares conceptual reference points with these. It's connected with environmental justice because energy is an environmental resource, and because energy developments often have environmental impacts. And it's connected with climate justice, of course, because the consumption of fossil fuels is a driver of climate change. So energy justice is closely connected to these other sets of justice concerns. Next, I'm going to introduce some of the concepts and theories that we use in energy justice. It's important that we have theories in order to help us decide what justice looks like, so that is, what's fair and what isn't fair. You might think it's obvious, but actually people might have competing ideas or claims about what is fair in any given situation. So concepts and principles help us to work through this and to make judgments. It's important to note that justice is not necessarily the same thing as equality. It might not mean always treating everyone the same at all times. I'm going to come back to that point a little later on. So in order to theorise energy justice, we draw on theories of justice from the wider social and political theory literature. So really what we're doing is applying theories of social justice to energy systems. And I'm going to introduce three of the main ones which you can think of as different dimensions of justice. These three are distributional justice, procedural justice, and justice as recognition. These are the concepts that you'll most often come across in the energy justice literature, I think. But there are other concepts of justice you might come across which I'd encourage you to explore. And I'm going to mention a further one that I think you might find useful, which is cognitive justice. Right, so starting with distributional justice. As the name suggests, this is concerned with how benefits and costs are distributed. This doesn't mean only in financial or economic terms, but it would also include other kinds of benefit and cost as well, for example, disruption or pollution. Distributional justice might mean that these benefits and costs should be shared evenly or equally. However, we might also use other principles. So, for example, distributional justice can mean that we want to give most benefits or least impacts to those people or communities who are generally less advantaged, so that we reduce wider inequality. And this principle would be along the lines of what political philosopher John Rawls called the difference principle. Typically, when we're thinking about distributional justice, we would be interested in how benefits and impacts are distributed in relation to social or economic characteristics such as poverty, ethnicity, or gender, for example. Next, turning to the second principle, which is procedural justice. So procedural justice is concerned with fairness and transparency in decision-making, policy-making, and other processes. And this has three dimensions, and here the UN's Aarhus Convention is often used as a reference point for these. First, procedural justice includes giving information. Access to information is really important for people to be informed of opportunities or of problems, and as a basis for them to be able to form views. Second, procedural justice includes allowing people who might be affected by a decision to have meaningful input into decision making. And third, it includes providing opportunity for people to appeal in some way if anything goes wrong or if the first two dimensions are not upheld. Procedural justice is linked to distributional justice because if procedures are fair, then outcomes are much more likely to be fair as well. And now the third principle, which is the principle of recognition. So recognition is a different aspect of justice that's been written about by theorists including Iris Marion Young and Nancy Fraser, and it's about eliminating any systematic marginalisation, discrimination or oppression of any social groups. It's basically about valuing everyone and treating everyone with respect. So in order to do this, we need to balance two aspects. On the one hand, it means treating everybody equally as being of equal worth. But on the other hand, it can also mean being aware of the ways in which people are different and acknowledging that some groups have specific needs that need to be addressed. So we might in some ways need to treat people differently in order to have more equal outcomes. So usually in energy justice and environmental justice, we understand these different aspects of justice or injustice to be interlinked and mutually reinforcing. I've already mentioned that procedural justice underpins distributional justice because fair procedures are more likely to lead to fair outcomes. But this also goes the other way to some extent because good procedures need resources. Recognition is also connected with distribution because if some groups of people aren't given equal status, then it's much more likely that they won't be treated fairly when it comes to distributing benefits and costs. Or to put it another way, a lack of recognition justifies unfair distributions. Again, this relationship also goes both ways because people who are in poverty or don't have access to resources often find it difficult to demand recognition. And then recognition and procedural justice are strongly connected because people need to be recognised as valid and capable decision makers in order to be included in procedures. Also, inclusive procedures means paying attention to difference and to supporting people to be able to give their input. So examples of this might be giving information in different formats or languages, or holding meetings in buildings that are accessible to people with disabilities. So as I said earlier, those are the three most commonly applied concepts of justice in energy justice, but I'm going to mention one other one now, which I think might be particularly relevant for work in some Latin American contexts, where indigenous communities are involved. And this dimension is cognitive justice, which is essentially about different forms of knowledge. So cognitive injustice is linked with colonialism and the oppression and dominance of indigenous peoples. As part of this domination, colonisers imposed their knowledge systems and indigenous ways of understanding the world were devalued and delegitimised, and that's a process which continues today. So this has been referred to as epistemicide, which means the murder of ways of knowing. In some cases, it's been complete murder, but in other cases, traditional knowledge systems have persisted, but they're often seen as backward or lacking legitimacy. So what cognitive justice requires is an openness to different ontologies, cosmologies, and knowledge systems, and a willingness to work with them. So this means more than accommodating different points of view or values. By ontologies and cosmologies, we're referring to different ways of understanding the fundamental nature of things. So, for example, cases where rivers might be understood as ancestors by some indigenous people, or where land features are sacred sites. So cognitive justice tends to be more of a concern in environmental justice, where in recent years there's been quite a lot of interest in traditional ecological knowledge. But it can be relevant to energy justice too, for example, when it comes to citing large-scale energy developments, which might have environmental and landscape impacts. Cognitive justice is sometimes seen as an extension of recognition, and I think it can be argued that way because it involves the recognition of distinct cultures. However, I think it's sometimes useful to think about it separately because it makes us pay specific attention to the knowledge systems in which we work and which frame our wider decision-making. And one implication, of course, is that it might also mean debating what justice means and being open to different concepts of justice, for example, including non-humans. Okay, so having introduced all of these concepts of justice, how does all of this relate back to energy systems? Well, to give some examples, it means that we should ask questions about the distribution of the benefits and impacts of energy developments, including renewable energy developments. We should ask questions about whether energy policy making and energy governance is fair and inclusive. We should ask questions about whose needs are being met with energy systems and whose are not. And we should ask whose knowledge and whose ways of knowing are considered legitimate. So, of course, in order to achieve justice, we're looking for what we need to do in order to address any problems that we find by asking these questions. These questions can be asked of the whole energy system, which would include production, distribution, consumption, energy efficiency, appliances, waste streams such as from coal mining or solar panels, and also energy innovations need to be checked for justice aspects. We don't always need to look at all of these things at the same time, of course, but we can assess any of these aspects of energy systems and more in terms of justice. So I hope that's been a helpful and interesting introduction. I've provided a further sheet with some more example questions that we might ask about energy justice, and I've given a list with some further reading as well about the concepts and also some interesting case studies. So I hope this gives you some things to discuss and maybe some ideas about how you might address energy justice in your own work.